welcome to this Lotus Sutra study. I was reflecting as I was working on this that I wanted to, instead of just moving through the remaining chapters and risk missing the forest for the trees, I wanted to first go back a little bit and do a kind of primer for the Lotus Sutra, because there is so much in this text, right? There is so much, there are so many teachings that it's challenging, to keep them all straight. And so I wanted to once again restate and hopefully reaffirm the teachings, the very important teachings that the Lotus Sutra is offering us. And in the process, hopefully make a little bit more clear why it is such an important text in Mahayana Buddhism, in Zen, in our own tradition, our own school, and also to highlight the stories that appear particularly in the parables, because the parables, one, are so memorable, and they have been handed down over, now over couple thousand years. And it is not unusual for someone who may not have a lot of exposure to Buddhism to recognize one of these stories, because they have become so ubiquitous. And so I want to give them the place that they deserve. And so this morning, to begin our study, let me share this quote from Bill Waldron, who's a professor of Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. He says, "Poetry, literature, and all art convey recurrent human truths, albeit expressed in constantly changing forms that we seldom mistake for universally valid scientific formulas. Religious languages, too, convey the distilled wisdom and compassion of human experience through the centuries, yet are often couched in symbolic images and stories that require their own distinctive modes of interpretation, more akin to poetry and art than to science or mathematics." So I think we can all recognize that this kind of religious, poetic language is what the Lotus Sutra is using. It is, in fact, more akin to poetry, to art than to science or mathematics. It makes use of myth rather than historical facts. Primarily, because it's not, it doesn't stand outside of history, of course, and it's not just making up facts when it comes particularly to the Buddhist teachings, but it relies primarily on myth, on simile, on parable. And why does it do this? Why, unlike the suttas of the Pali Canon, this quintessentially Mahayana Sutra uses so much metaphor? Why does it use all of these parables and this very elaborate imagery? Another way of asking this question is, what are the problems the sutra is trying to solve or is trying to address that it can't do in a logical, discursive, let's call it scientific way? And to remind all of us when this was happening. So the Lotus Sutra was first discovered around the 1st century, before the Common Era. So roughly 200, 300 years after the Buddha's death. And the most common version that we use today is a Chinese translation of a Sanskrit version by Kumarajiva. He was a monk and scholar in the 5th century. And the text was likely compiled in 3 sections, chapters 2 through 9, during that 1st century before the Common Era, chapters 1, 10, 11, and 13 to 22 during the second century, and chapters 12, 23 to 28, roughly 150, a second century, yes, a common era, and these last around 150 of the common era. So the whole text takes about 250 years to write, which is quite a bit of time, right, for the teachings to be contained in it, to be formulated and to be developed. And so this is significant. All of this time, the scholars, the teachers, the practitioners, the commentators are refining, elaborating on, complementing the teachings that were already there. As was happening also with the Pali Canon. But the Lotus Sutra ends up presenting us with a very thorough, I was going to say complete, but I don't think any teaching is ever complete, a very thorough picture of specifically the Mahayana teachings. And so what are these? All of us, without exception, are trying to be happy and not to suffer. All of us are trying to not feel pain, or at least not so much pain. And more importantly, to not suffer, to not experience the suffering that accompanies it. And so those of us who come to practice, generally we do so at first looking for a way to not suffer, and finding that way, maybe we decide to stay with it. There might be those who, because of karmic conditions, come to it solely for an altruistic motive. They really just want to serve. They just want to help others. But I think it's probably true to say that most of us come because in some way we're in pain, because something is not making sense, and we're looking for a way to address that. Last week, as I was spending some time with my fellow Buddhist teachers, I was reminded that those of us who decide to dedicate our lives to the Dharma do so because we think it is the most effective way to put an end to the suffering that we see in ourselves and in the world. And so when you encounter some aversion to a teaching, when you encounter resistance, when you're not so sure about the form, the content, the meaning of a particular teaching, always important to discern, to question, to wonder, is this true? Is this in line with reality? But particularly if what you're finding first off is resistance or aversion, consider that the reason it is here, certainly when we speak of the Buddhist teachings, the reason this appears is because someone was trying to alleviate your suffering. That might give all of us an entry point, at the very least. If after reflection and practice and some consideration, you decide this is not for me, this particular form of practice or of teaching is not for me, that's fine. But at the very least, you have endeavored to meet it, which is, of course, our task, to meet the Dharma, so that then we can integrate it into our lives, we can practice it, we can offer its wisdom, its teachings to others. And so those of us who have done this, who have decided to place it at the center of our lives, are doing so because we believe that it actually does present an effective and lasting solution to the problem, the persistent problem of our dissatisfaction, dukkha. We know that the reason this dissatisfaction exists is because of clinging, because we want what we don't have, we have what we don't want, And what we have, we can't keep. The suffering that comes from clinging. There's also the suffering that comes from impermanence, which is that third one. And the suffering of the dissatisfaction that comes from believing in this self as a fixed, independent agent. We also know this, but stop for a moment to reflect, why is that so unsatisfactory? We think that we are agents, independent agents of our lives, that in some way that we are in control. But we're not. If it was true that we are in control, that we are acting independently of everything else, we would be able to only experience what we want to experience. We would be able to choose what is beautiful, what is pleasing, what is joyful. If we really were independent beings, we would not be affected by what happens to other beings, what happens in other places of the world, what happens to other types of beings. We would be able to choose our lives always. And of course, that is not what happens. Instead, we are subject to causes and conditions, most of which are beyond my control. So if I'm an anxious person, for example, I mean, chances are I'm not choosing to be anxious. It's not what I want to be. And I can understand perhaps that as a child, I was maybe left alone a lot. Those were some of the causes and conditions. And not knowing what was happening, not knowing whether I would be safe, I grew fearful, restless, worried. And then I carried that fear into my adult life. So it's not my fault that I'm anxious, but it is my responsibility. Because that anxiety will shape how I act in the world, at least in part. And so because of certain causes and certain actions, because of their effects, and because of the supporting conditions, the supporting factors, of which I am not in control, I do experience things I don't want, things I don't like and wouldn't choose. Pretty frequently. And so I suffer. And then I die. Which seems like a very bad deal, a terrible deal, if you're into making deals. Life sucks and then you die. It's not all bad, of course. But I often don't get what I want, and then I do know I will die. And so that's very disappointing. Except this isn't a deal. Nobody signed a contract. And there's no fine print that we fail to read. Although we often act out as if there were. We're offended by this setup that is a finite human life. It is not a deal. It is the wheel of samsara, the endless round of rebirths, in which we're trapped because of our greed, our anger, and our ignorance, our desire, our aversion, and our delusion, the three poisons. Buddhism says these are what power that wheel, particularly ignorance, as we know, because that drives the whole thing. Not understanding, we act out of our confusion, and that keeps the wheel rolling. And the reason we're trapped, not just in this life, but from life to life, is because of karma, because of cause and effect. There is in the world an inexorable law. Every single cause is followed by an effect. You can't have one without the other. Would you agree? I mean, can you think of any cause that is not followed by an effect? In fact, to call it a cause, there must be an effect, and vice versa. And it is not even that one leads to the other. Nagarjuna makes this very clear. Dogen makes this very clear when he says, firewood does not become ash. It's not that the cause leads to the effect, is they are completely interdependent, mutually arising, was the phrase that Daito would often use. They arise simultaneously, everything at once. And according to Buddhism, death doesn't cut off that causal chain. So those causes and conditions from one life carry over into the next life, even though the person who experienced those causes and conditions does not. Right? So it's not Zuisei who is reincarnated, because there is nothing independent that is Zuisei that could carry over to another life. There is just the causes and conditions. There is that energy, if you will. So think of it like flipping off a light switch. You know, when you turn off the light, the electrical circuit opens and it interrupts the flow of electrons moving through the wires, you know, the electricity. But the potential energy remains, right? It doesn't just disappear, because energy, as we know, is neither created nor destroyed. It can only be transformed. So it's like that. You know, death flips the switch on this life, Zuisei's life, Vanessa's life, but the energy behind it, its driving force, continues into the next. Unless something happens to shut off the circuit permanently. And that is what is called nirvana, the unconditioned, the unbinding. It's the complete severing, stopping of the outflows early Buddhism calls the taints, which are greed, anger, and ignorance. That's why the image of a candle being snuffed out is given for nibbana. And stay with me for a second. We'll get to the Lotus Sutra, but this is all leading us to it. It's only nirvana or nibbana that is completely free of causes and conditions. In early Buddhism, it stands outside the chain of dependent origination. It stands outside of time. It transcends cause and effect, and it's a realm that is totally ineffable. Yet when experienced, it's a state of utter peace and happiness, complete freedom. In early Buddhism, there are three types of beings who can attain nibbana. An arhat, and they can attain nibbana with or without remainder. So with remainder, they're still living. They're still acting without the taints of that greed and anger and ignorance. Or they can die, or when they die, they attain nibbana without remainder. And they're not reborn ever again. This is the ultimate goal. In early Buddhism, this is the ultimate goal, the Holy Grail, to be completely, utterly free from suffering and that round of rebirths. The second type of being is the Pratyeka Buddha, the solitary Buddha. They attain nirvana, but they don't really share it with others. And then there are the Bodhisattvas, who in early Buddhism are really just the Buddhas to be. It's the step before Buddhahood. So that the ideal of the Bodhisattva as one who dedicates themselves to everyone's realization, that is a Mahayana teaching. So Bodhisattvas in the Pali Canon are future Buddhas. All of these appear in the Lotus Sutra. And then there's also a fourth kind of being, a Samyak Sambuddha, perfectly enlightened Buddha who attains nirvana spontaneously. But they are so rare that there's only ever one per era, Shakyamuni being the prime example. And according to the early canon, they need to be male, since the Buddha was male. But I'll leave that aside for now. And so, the problem is we suffer. The reason is our clinging, mainly. But the good news is we don't have to, because there's a path to the end of suffering. But it's a long and arduous path. And the way that it was laid out, at least originally, it really did seem as if only monastics who were completely dedicated to it would ever be able to complete it. And periodically, people still ask that question, actually. And can you really do it as a lay practitioner? My answer is a resounding yes. But you're definitely going to have to put some oomph behind it. And so at the time, in fact, that the Lotus Sutra was written, there were all of these Buddhist schools, different Buddhist schools were popping up. And with them, there were all kinds of internecine wars about their goals and their practices. Who could attain enlightenment? Who could not? How would they do this? And there was quite a bit of debate about this. Whose is the correct Dharma? Whose is the Dharma that will actually lead to that liberation? But, just bring it close to home so that we can better understand this. Imagine that the Dalai Lama came out right now and said, Zen is not an authentic Buddhist school. You don't have the true Buddha Dharma. All that quiet sitting that you do, this koan practice, that's not authentic teaching. It's provisional, it will help you, but it's not really the real thing. It's only yidam practice, visualizations. There's a chosen deity that you visualize and you become. That's the only thing that can take you to liberation. And what do you think would happen? Zen teachers everywhere would pop up and argue against it. They'd find ways to prove that our way, our practice, our realization is just as authentic as the Buddha's. And they would pull out examples from the Zen texts, or, the more enterprising ones might create their own texts to prove without a doubt that the teachings of the Zen school are in fact authentic Dharma, are the Buddha's words. That's what happened when a group of most likely Chinese monks began to write the Lotus Sutra. Now you had these three vehicles, the Pratyekayana, the Shravakayana, those are the Arhats, and the Bodhisattvayana. And they're all argument, which vehicle will actually lead to Nibbana. And on the side, quietly, these Chinese monks are compiling the Lotus Sutra with its revolutionary teachings. Actually, there is only one vehicle. Those other vehicles were a little bit like training wheels. They're helpful, I help you keep your balance as you're walking that path. But they're not the ultimate teaching. There's only one vehicle, the Ekayana. And there's, in fact, a contemporary lineage, Triratna, which was founded by a British practitioner who had extensive training in all three schools, Theravada, Mahayana, particularly Zen, I believe, and Vajrayana. And so he created the Triratna order. They call themselves Ekayana Buddhists. Had a lovely conversation with one of them last week. And so this is not also, an ancient thing. There's the one vehicle, and it is Buddhahood. One Dharma, which the Buddha teaches through all sorts of skillful means. upaya. And it's in essence that all of you, without exception, will become Buddhas. And not only that, because you're listening to this teaching of the Buddha presented in the Lotus Sutra, and because the Buddha only teaches bodhisattvas, according to the sutra, that means that you, right now, are a bodhisattva. You didn't need to do anything to gain that title, to gain that state. Just because you're listening to the teaching of the Buddha, you are a Buddha to be. And it is guaranteed that at some point you will reach your quote unquote, your goal. You will attain Buddhahood. You don't have to be a monk. You don't have to be learned. You don't have to be a man. You don't even have to be human. You don't have to sit for hours and days and weeks. When it comes to humans, you just have to be devoted. You just have to have faith and practice. All you have to do to realize yourself, to attain liberation, is to completely revere, to trust in, revere the Lotus Sutra and preach the Lotus Sutra and copy the Lotus Sutra. And if you do this wholeheartedly, you will realize its true teaching, which, in case you missed it, is that you're already on the path to Buddhahood. So that means anywhere, anyone, anywhere, regardless of what they have done, regardless of who they are, regardless of how little or how much they know about Buddhism, about the teachings, regardless about how much time they have to practice, they are guaranteed to attain Buddhahood. And they're already bodhisattvas. I think if we were more inclined to faith, we would really feel what an incredibly hopeful and comforting teaching this would be. And in fact, when you read the commentators, particularly priests, Nichiren priests, Shin Buddhist priests, Pure Land, Tendai priests, this is what they constantly highlight: the hopeful, positive message of the Lotus Sutra. But even if you don't, you're not quite there. Even in our own school of Zen, when we say that we don't sit to become Buddhas, we sit as Buddhas, as the expression of our Buddhahood, as the expression of that inherent awakening, we owe that teaching in great part to the Lotus Sutra, as we owe the teaching that samsara is nirvana. Another revolutionary teaching. Nirvana is actually not some transcendental state that you will reach at the end of the path, of that long and arduous path. Nirvana is right here, right now, and it takes a thought instant. I think that's the phrase. As the dragon girl shows, in an instant, she becomes enlightened. It's not through years and years and kalpas of practice. This transcendental realm is actually right here, right now. And if that's not revolutionary, then I don't know what is. So the Lotus Sutra radically appended the Buddhist teachings, which were already radical to begin with. And so instead of starting with the three poisons of greed, anger, and ignorance, and then having to scrabble your way to Buddhahood through a lot of effort and practice, we begin with Buddhahood and work to uncover, unpeel that truth in our lives. And that is very much a Zen teaching. not only hopeful, but compassionate. Because that means there is nothing stopping you. There is no karma in your mind stream, no matter how heavy, no matter how awful it may seem, that can get in the way of you and Buddhahood. There is nothing you have done or might ever do that would prevent you from realizing yourself as a Buddha. I've told the story of a friend who went to an AA meeting and he heard another participant say, I know I'm broken. And he thought, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. I don't think this is for me. And then he came to Buddhism and he heard someone say, you're perfect and complete, lacking nothing. You just need to realize it. And he thought, I'm home. But if we're all already Buddhas, why is it so hard to see that? And this too is a problem that the Lotus Sutra is trying to address. Because it's really saying it's not hard. It's just that the teachings you heard before were not the true teachings. Right? As I said, they were helpful, but they were not the Buddha's authentic teachings. So you were just, a little confused. These are the teachings you want to pay attention to. And all you need to do is embrace, read, recite, copy, and preach the Lotus Sutra, the 5 practices that lead to liberation. And if you're pressed for time, just chant. Just chant this title, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, and you're set. So in addition to the central theme, universal Buddhahood, importance of skillful means, need for faith and devotion on the path, and the Lotus Sutra is also establishing the Buddha as a cosmic, timeless principle. This is in this section that we have read. The reason the Buddha could teach all of those millions of bodhisattvas and bring them to realization, even though Shakyamuni Buddha only taught for 43, 44 years, roughly, is that in truth, the Buddha was always there. He's always been here, will always be here, always preaching the Lotus Sutra, always teaching the Dharma. And so we move from this historical figure of the Pali Canon who lived and taught and died to this universal principle of enlightenment. And it is no longer something that we do, but something that we're destined to experience by calling on the Lotus Sutra, which is also the embodiment of the Buddha. And that is why faith is so important. We trust that even though we're deluded now, through our practice and devotion, we'll come to realize that Buddhahood that's always been present. And so faith itself becomes a manifestation of Buddha nature. But that's true for us too. That's true for us too, actually. You don't do insight. You don't make insight happen. You can only create the most propitious causes and conditions for insight to appear. Like you clear away the cobwebs of the mind so that it can reveal its naturally luminous nature. So yes, there is a lot of work, there is practice, there's striving. But that any level, any depth of realization, you don't do yourself. There is something else at play here. And again, just because we may not be able to relate to a teaching does not mean that it's not true. Speaking now with my fellow, the Nichiren priests, the Tendai priests, their practice was utterly devoted to this faith of their own Buddha nature and their compassionate insistence on making sure that everybody else knows it too. That those who come to them for guidance understand you are not broken. You're just a little confused. But there's a way for you to clear that confusion. So like that parable of the medicinal herbs, one rain nourishes all kinds of plants and herbs, trees and groves. It's one Dharma, one flavor, one taste, the Sutra says. It's a very famous phrase as a way to describe the Buddha's teachings. But it equally nourishes beings of all different capacities, all different dispositions. So every time you think to yourself, I'm not smart enough, I'm not determined enough, I'm not devoted enough, I'm not whatever enough, remember, it doesn't matter, because that rain falls equally on all beings. And how wonderful that we live in a place and at a time where I can do my thing and the Nichiren priest can do his thing. How wonderful that all of these different streams flow from the one source and that we have access to them. I mean, it is incredible what you can find. You spend a little bit of time, just sitting in my little apartment in Panama, doing research on these various schools, and all of these treasures. I mean, it is overwhelming almost. How incredibly fortunate we are. When my teacher Shugen Roshi was practicing, when he first started, he said there was like one book on Buddhism, and he just read it over and over and over again. And then he sat on his own for 10 years before looking around and being like, I wonder if there's a teacher that I can study with. The parables, the reason, first, they're good stories. And of course, as I said at the beginning, they're very memorable. But I think they're also very helpful because they think of them as them saying less about what the Buddha is saying about the Dharma and more about what the Dharma is saying about us, about the human condition. And so why use simile and parable, again, imagery, and a kind of magic, Kisei said, almost, to communicate the teachings, to get our attention, I think. In reality, because of what I said a moment ago, because there are certain teachings, certain experiences that can't be communicated linearly, logically. We know you can't bring your spreadsheet mind to the Lotus Sutra or to koan study. And so seeing the Lotus Sutra as the Buddha, seeing yourself as a cypress tree is not your spreadsheet mind. Afterwards, if you want to talk about it, if you want to write a book about it, you can. And then the spreadsheet mind will be helpful. But in that moment, another type of awareness is operating. And the parables are not that specifically, but they're alluding to that. They're trying to engage in you the mind that is not just evaluating and editing and comparing, because that here is not going to help you to see what you need to see. And it certainly won't free you. So there are 7 parables in the Lotus Sutra. The burning house, the wealthy father and son, sometimes known as the prodigal son, the medicinal herbs, it's also called reign of the Dharma, the magic city, or the phantom city, the jewel in the robe, the precious pearl in the top knot, and the excellent physician. We won't have time to cover all of them, and so we'll do some of them next time. Now, some of the Chinese commentators add, or the East Asian traditions actually add 2 more stories. They split the parable of the medicinal herbs into the herbs and the clouds, the rain clouds, because the herbs stand for disciples, us, and the rain clouds, the Buddha and the Buddha's teachings. And then that other short story of, the person who's digging for water in the desert, as in chapter 10. So they're digging in the sand, and at first, they dig a little bit and the sand is dry, but they don't give up because they sense that water is near. And so they keep digging, and then they reach mud, and then they know, oh, there's water. And of course, this is a simile for Buddhahood. We sense that it is present, that it is possible, but in the beginning, we can't even see it. And so we are trusting, we are having faith that what the teachings are pointing to, that what the teachers are teaching is true, and something that I might be able to see at some point. And so it speaks to faith and determination and patience, persistence, and the work required to uncover the truth. You could also add some of the other stories, like, Bodhisattva never disparaging, which is one of my favorite stories in the Lotus Sutra, but is not considered a parable. It is not told as a parable. And so in the burning house, a father tricks his children into leaving that burning house. They're playing with their toys, and he says, there are better toys out there. There are better and bigger carts out there than the ones you're playing with. And just the burning house, if you remember, is not just burning. It's dilapidated. It's falling down. The stairs are breaking. There's like the walls are peeling. There's holes all over the place. There's like trash all over. And it's covered with demons and yakshas and ghosts. And that house, of course, is our world. It's our lives. It's the world of samsara. It's our minds sometimes, right? Just think of when your mind is filled with anxiety, with doubt, with jealousy, with anger, with resentment. Doesn't it feel like you're being eaten alive? I like that image that one teacher offered for anger. Anger is like pushing someone into a river of lava and then jumping in behind them. You can't just put it out there. And so that house filled with demons is not actually out there. Another reason to come back to responsibility is not what politicians are doing, is not what other nations are doing, is not what my family is doing, is what happens here and what gets lived out, played out there. I periodically think of horror stories, horror films, which I don't watch, but on occasion I will read one. I actually just read a short novel, a novella by a Argentinian writer, and there's never anything explicit, and it is terrifying. It wounds winds itself very, very tightly. But it's really based on the rise of pesticides in agriculture. Apparently, Argentina is the leading producer of GMOs, genetically modified. What does the O stand for?
Organisms.
Organisms, thank you. I was going to say objects, but that didn't sound right. And it's a horror story. And she says that she often gets interviewed, and people are like, you write these horror stories, because she has others, but you're so nice. And she said, yeah, it's a kind of exorcism. It's a kind of putting out there and making sense of the horror of the demons, inside, but also the demons that we see in the world. So I'm not a fan, generally speaking, of these stories, but I understand. I understand why we are compelled to tell them, and it makes sense. And I think used well, they actually can be a form of cleansing. But, even without the extremes, the house is burning, as the Buddha famously said in the fire sermon. The eye is burning, the ear is burning, the nose is burning, the mind is burning, ideas are burning. Burning with what? With the fire of greed, the fire of anger, the fire of ignorance. So there they are again, the fetters that keep us bound, that keep us conditioned. And so leaving the house is leaving the world of samsara for the world of nirvana. But in order for the metaphor to fully work, I guess it would be, that you realize the house itself as the Buddha feels, and the demons get transformed into devas. But here is the Buddha is trying to get them to get out of the house. The Buddha is the father, and he's trying to get the kids to get out of the burning house. But like us, they're too entranced by their toys. They're too caught by the dream. And so they ignore him. They ignore the teachings. And in the framework of the Lotus Sutra, they're playing with the cards of the Pratyeka Buddhas, the cards of the Arhats, the cards of the Bodhisattvas. And when they come out, and the Buddha, the father offers this big ox cart, I think it is, it's supposed to be, the Buddha vehicle, that one vehicle. But the good news is the father is also in the house. So we're never just left by ourselves. As I was saying a moment ago, we're never alone with our confusion, our delusion. And he, quote unquote, tells the children what they want to hear. And this is how he gets them to get out of the house. And as is true here, and in some of the other stories and some of the other sutras in the Pali Canon, the Buddha then asks his monks, is the Buddha lying when he tricks his children? Does he make use of a falsehood? And Shariputra says, no. He's using skillful means to save the children's lives. And it's really important to say here, to stress that it's not, the Buddha, the sutras are not justifying unethical behavior. They're not saying, go around lying to people. They're certainly not encouraging teachers to lie to their students. They are pointing to the difficulty of helping those who sometimes are so asleep, they don't want to wake up. They're too comfy in bed. And you can't force them. You can't pull them out of bed. You can only encourage them. And as is true of any parent, it's hard to watch your children struggle. It's certainly hard if you know they're in danger of dying, of being burned alive. It's hard when you see them choose their toys over walking out of the house, because you know the cost of that choice, but you can't make it for them. And so all you can do is trust. All you can do is guide them out of the house into their inheritance, as the next parable says. And so a teacher does indeed need to use all manner of skillful means to get her students to pay attention, listen to the teachings, put them into practice. You have to be mother, entertainer, cheerleader, cop, all rolled into one, and more. And sometimes you have to tell them what they want to hear so that they'll listen to what you have to tell them. In the parable of the prodigal son, arguably the most famous, it's the longest, the Lotus Sutra, is it's a type of archetypal hero's journey. There's a quest, there's overcoming obstacles, and there's change, there's transformation in the end. And it's not a coincidence that it appears in the chapter called Belief and Understanding, or better, Faith and Understanding. And so, as I mentioned earlier, in Nichiren Buddhism, where the Lotus Sutra is the main text, faith is equal to practice. So it's not blind belief, not even blind belief in the Buddha, but it's really trust in that kind of dynamic, harmonious nature of the universe. It's trust in the fact that things actually do work, can work. And we're aligning ourselves with that universal principle. And in Nichiren Buddhism, it is expressed through the practice of chanting the Daimoku, Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. For us, it gets expressed through Zazen. We sit as the harmony of the universe. That is why, yet another reason to protect your Zazen, to really let that be. Harmonious doesn't mean, you control your thoughts so that they're all nice. You don't fight them. You just don't fight them. So that when you get off your seat, off your cushion, and step into the messy world, you can better discern that harmony and align yourself with it. Because it's hard, right? It's challenging. It's very challenging to do that. Particularly because everybody else has very different ideas about what that harmony should look like. And so, here in this parable, we don't know why the son leaves. But I think maybe it's not necessary to have a specific reason. I think it's just the running that we all do when we don't want to face what is difficult to face. The detours that we take, something in us knows what it is that we want to do, whether it's in terms of the spiritual path or just our lives. And something about us is like not ready or not wanting yet to go there, to face it. And so we run away. But the implication of this parable is that although the son gets lost and spends a long time lost, 50 years, the sutra says, the math doesn't quite add up when you really look at the sutra closely, at the parable closely, because the son would have to be, I don't know, how old would the father be then by the time the son comes back and still is working 20 years at the stables. I mean, maybe he leaves when he's a kid. I guess that's possible. But he goes wandering and is lost for a long time. And he finds his way home by accident. Really, he just kind of sees this wonderful, beautiful house with all these people and this great person, with a retinue. He's like, ooh, who's that powerful person? He does not recognize his father. We do not recognize the Buddha's teaching. But even there's something operating underneath because he's not conscious of it. But, he's drawn to that house. He's drawn to that person. sitting there on his high chair. And so, this parable is saying coming home is always possible and always within reach. That's why it doesn't matter how far you've wandered or how long. It doesn't matter because it just takes a moment to come back. And so the spiritual quest is really always a returning, which is not a returning at all, because when you get there, you realize, oh, I never left. This sense of not belonging, of being separated from something fundamental, this sense of deep aloneness that we have, is thinking we've gotten lost, we've gone wandering. And eventually what you realize is, oh, I was actually always in the house and it's no longer burning. And look at all these people, they're here with me too. All of these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. But you don't feel that in the beginning. You do feel, I think those of us who are paying attention recognize this feeling of disconnectedness. And maybe we look around and we wonder, does anyone else feel what I feel? And if you look at it, the sun is really kind of embodying everything that keeps us bound. He's afraid, he's insecure, he's deeply, deeply doubting of himself, his capacity. So when his father recognizes him and tries, to give him his inheritance, is what he deserves, is his birthright, the son freaks out. He thinks they're coming to imprison him. And he gets so scared, he faints. He passes out. I think of this as when we get sleepy in Zazen, when you're not really tired, but you can't stay awake. It's like you're passed out because you just can't take all this goodness. What do you mean I'm a Buddha? What do you mean I'm already perfect and complete? No, I'll just go to sleep. Or it's that moment where you get really, really deep and then yourself freaks out and boom, you jerk. Your body jerks and you're out of your samadhi. Or your mind just starts the self reasserting itself. Or like that moment when Bodhisattva disparaging says to someone, I would never dare disparage you because you too are a Buddha. And the person is like, who are you to make this irresponsible prediction? I love that. They get angry and they shoo him off. In fact, they beat him away. Get out of here. I'm not a Buddha. How dare you tell me I'm a Buddha? How dare you give me such responsibility? I don't want it. I'm not ready. I'm not able. Others, maybe, not me. Sometimes we would just rather keep playing with our toys. Claim ignorance until there's a shakedown. And so in the parable, the son works for the father for years, shoveling shit, literally. He's shoveling manure because that's the only job that he thinks he's cut out for. And little by little, the father, the teacher, coaxes him out of himself, his doubt, begins to show loving kindness to him. In the beginning, remember, in the parable, he's gruff because he thinks that's the only treatment, that the son will accept. And then little by little, he starts to get close. Oh, you're doing this really well. How about you do this other task? Oh, you did that pretty well. How about you do this other thing? Take on a little more responsibility. Does this sound familiar? But I'm not ready. I'm not ready for this. You are. I don't think so. No, really, you are. It's okay. Trust me. You are. Years ago, when a group of teachers met with the Dalai Lama, I've told this story, Western teachers, they were talking about self-doubt and low self-esteem, self-hatred. And at one point, they're trying to explain this to the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama just looks at his translator. They go back and forth for a while. And he's like, low self-esteem, like, what is that? And the teachers explain, well, in general, and this was particularly US and Europe, the teachers from all over the world were saying, we don't regard ourselves very highly. And so deep down, we really think we don't deserve what we have. And His Holiness was like, but why? You're all Buddhas. You're all Buddhas. And that sometimes our inability to face what is difficult to face, it's so ironic and unfortunate that sometimes we would rather choose pain than freedom. We would rather choose our suffering than liberation. I came across this study, 2014, they did a study at University of Virginia, where it was roughly about 40 people, men and women, who were given an option. They were put in a room, bare room, no furniture, no extras. I mean, it was probably just a chair and a table. And they were said, you have to sit here for 15 minutes. There was a series of experiments, but this one was 15 minutes. You sit here without anything, your phones, anything to read, nothing, just you and your mind. You can just sit there quietly, or if you want something to do, you can give yourself an electric shock. And they gave people the shock at the beginning, and then they asked them, would you pay money to not experience this shock, before they explained what the experiment was? And everyone said, yes, I would pay money not to feel that again. And then when the experiment came, 67% of men, 25% of women chose to shock themselves rather than just be still and quiet. One gentleman, the outlier in the group, shocked himself 190 times during those 15 minutes, I guess, which is a little scary. And so that is the challenge that we teachers sometimes face. Sometimes we would rather choose a mild shock, mild pain, rather than be still and quiet. Reading the Lotus Sutra now, as a teacher, I find so much in it that I can relate to. What I want most is for all of you and for anyone whom I encounter to be free of suffering, to be able to live their lives joyfully, happily, clearly, and free of suffering. That is what I most want. And there are a lot of things that get in the way of that, including in my own life. And so I am coming to see this process that is teaching the Dharma to be a continuous process of learning how to teach the Dharma, trying and failing and trying and failing and trying and failing a lot and trying, because I don't want to give up and because I believe that freedom is possible and because I want other people to experience it. And so all of these stories and all of these teachings and all of these carrots are to keep people engaged, to keep people on the path, to keep people inspired. I have thought about this. There was a time when I thought, I really want to just bring this down to the basics. I just want to sit, and I'm going to get rid of the forms. And I'm really, the main thing is sitting, right? So I really want people to experience that. And then I realized very quickly that if I did that, I probably would be sitting by myself, maybe with one or two people for a little bit. But if I got rid of the stages, you become a student, and you take Jukai at one point, and you become a Shuso, you become a teacher. All of those, in one sense, are arbitrary markers. They're not necessary for your liberation. And a little bit of the performance aspect of them, the hoopla that comes with them, is also not necessary. And it helps. Because being the way we are, myself included, it has been helpful to feel at different points on my path. Oh, I got here. Oh, I arrived somewhere, and it seems I'm doing kind of okay. Other people say that I'm doing okay, so I must be doing okay. And that helped. I mean, it can also go to your head, and that happens too, and then that's not skillful. But it helps to feel that you are part of something, and that there is a sort of progression, even though we keep saying it's not linear, and yes, there's no goal. I know that is true on one end, on one sense, and in another sense, there is development, there is progression. And knowing that you're doing okay, and that you're that you're doing it, and that you're practicing, that you're moving through things, is actually helpful and inspiring. And so I think the Lotus Sutra is trying to do what every teacher in every time in every country has tried to do, which is to keep reminding all of us, Buddhahood is real. Liberation is possible. Each of you can attain it. You do have to be a little patient. You have to be a little persistent. You do have to trust enough on the path, on the teachings, on your capacity to do it. You have to trust enough on someone who can kind of guide you, accompany on the path, you on the path. You have to trust enough a group that will keep you company so that you realize, I'm not doing this on my own. And some of the things that you'll say and that you'll do won't work. They'll fall flat. Some of the things you'll say or do will work really well for some people, and others will hate them, and they'll never come back. And then you're like, okay. And then I keep trying. Oh, this worked. Oh, this worked. Oh, okay. This worked. I'll keep that. This I'll discard. And you just keep trying, because what else would you do with this one precious life?